everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Stench of Truth radio show here on Blog Talk Radio, blogtalkradio.com/the Stench of Truth. First, I want to tell you about the song that introduced the show today that was called Desperate Moments. That is produced by a friend of mine on YouTube who goes by the username Vocal Brush. So if you like her music, by all means, check out her channel on YouTube. That's Vocal Brush, VOCALBRUSH. And I'll be having some other songs of hers as introductory material and for fill-ins if I need that, which I may need to fill in a minute or two later on because I do not yet have Mr. Albarelli on the line. He is waiting for an important phone call, so hopefully probably in about 10 minutes or so I'll try to get him on the line, and maybe I'll put a little music in there to fill the space while I get him and get everything all set up. So, as you know from the episode notes, my guest today is Hank Albarelli Jr. He has written a book entitled A Terrible Mistake: The Murder of Frank Olson and the CIA's Secret Cold War Experiments. And quite a tome it is, I must say. It is like 800 pages long, filled with notes and documents and an incredible amount of material, which he has put together that tells the story of Frank Olson, but more importantly also tells the story of the CIA's involvement in mind control experimentation, and that would be under the auspices of a project most widely known as MKULTRA. But of course, MKULTRA was just one project grouping of mind control experiments, and another one that some of you may be familiar with is MK-Delta, which dealt with biological weapons. And since Frank Olson worked at Fort Detrick, there is a great deal of cross-connection between the two. And for those of you who do not know who Frank Olson is, Frank Olson was a person affiliated with the CIA, the military, and with Fort Detrick, and he supposedly committed suicide. And the book details the affair, everything that led up to his tragic death and the aftermath, and all of the different programs that were affiliated with Olson's work with Fort Detrick and the CIA. And so I'll read you a little bit of introductory material here, and then after we're done with that, I'll try to get Mr. Albarelli on the line, and we'll be ready to go. First, I'll give you a biography of Mr. Albarelli. H.P. Albarelli Jr. is a writer and an investigative reporter who lives in the Tampa Bay area of Florida. He has written numerous feature articles about the 9/11 Anthrax attacks, the history of biological warfare, the mysterious death of Dr. Frank Olson, the Cuban Revolution, and social and political affairs. Some of these articles can be found on the WorldNet Daily, Pravda, Cubanet, Counterpunch, and Crime Magazine websites. Albarelli has also written feature articles for Tampa's alternative newspaper, The Weekly Planet. His work has been acknowledged and cited in American History magazine and in books by many distinguished authors, including The Biology of Doom by Ed Regis, Henry Holt and Company, 2001, Alston Chase's classic, Harvard and the Unabomber, The Education of an American Terrorist, W.W. Norton, 2003, and The 80 Greatest Conspiracies of All Time by Jonathan Vankin and John Whalen, Citadel Press, 2004. An accomplished scriptwriter and playwright, Albarelli's Life Goes On, written with his brother, Dean Albarelli, was published by Witness, a literary journal. In 1995, he produced and directed a regional production of Academy Award winners Steve Tessich's play On the Open Road, brilliantly scored by composer Sam Jeppe. Albarelli's 6-year investigation into the controversial death of Army biochemist Dr. Frank Olson was the focal point of an hour-long television documentary, Mind Control Murder, produced by London's award-winning Principal Films. David Presswell, director, for A&E's investigative reports, and by independent film producer Scott Kalonico for the short film LSD A Go-Go, shown at the 2004 Sundance Film Festival. Albarelli is a graduate of Antioch Law School and has traveled extensively throughout Europe, South Africa, and Asia. He is a noted expert on the history of the CIA's behavior modification and assassination programs of the 1950s. Books to be published by Albarelli in the near future include The Heap, a novel, A Terrible Mistake, The Murder of Frank Olson and the CIA's Secret Cold War Experiments, which is out, and you can get a copy, and Stormy Monday, a fictional account of infamous narcotics agent George Hunter White's activities in the 1950s. That sounds like that would be a good book as well. And here we have a little bit from Peter Levenda's foreword to the book, A Terrible Mistake. I don't want to give away the story that Hank has uncovered or any of the juicy details or important discoveries that will change the way you look at this case. You need to read this book carefully, cover to cover, to understand the enormity of what transpired that autumn evening in Midtown Manhattan. The number of interconnected links between people, places, and events is astounding. Familiar names like Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld turn up, as well as Warren Berger and Rudolph Giuliani, Howard Hughes and Robert Mayhew. Less familiar names like John Rousselot, an American congressman, and John Bircher, accused of being involved in the assassination plot against President Kennedy, also make an appearance. A walk through Hank Albarelli's masterful presentation of the Frank Olson case is like a tour of American political and cultural life during the last 60 years or more, and at the same time it is a descent into a very particular hell. Is there such a thing as negative nostalgia? And there's more. A couple of websites that you can go to find information on and about Hank Albarelli. First of all is his personal website, which is www.albarelli.net. That's albarelli.net, which has documents, biography, which I read from, and other material. The website for the book itself is www.aterriblemistake.com. That's A Terrible Mistake, all one word, .com. And also, you can buy the book through his website, which, if I'm not mistaken, I think it leads you directly to Trine Day. But if it does not do that, you can also buy the book at Trine Day. And, of course, if you've been listening to the show for a while, you'll know that Trine Day is run by Chris Milligan, a previous guest on the show, and I would very much like to promote his site and the books that he brings to people. So if you don't get the book some other way, then I highly suggest that you go through Trine Day to do so. Now it looks like I should be okay to try to bring Hank on the line. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play a little bit of another song here while I try to bring Hank on the line. So enjoy the music for a moment or two while I try to bring up Hank Albarelli for us.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Okay, that was a little bit from Manchurian Sun, also by Vocal Brush. please check out her YouTube website, and that would be youtube.com/user/vocalbrush. That's all one word, VOCALBRUSH. She provided me with some music to introduce my songs to use as filler material for if I need it, and that was a little bit from Fortunate Son. So please check her out and support her work, because she's a great independent music producer, writes her own stuff, writes her own music, and I really dig it, so I hope you do too. Anyway, I have Mr. Albarelli on the line right now, and we're going to be talking about Frank Olson and what happened to him, and also hopefully we'll also be able to touch on some of the other areas that Hank has talked about in his articles, such as the Anthrax attacks from 9/11, which is a fascinating subject that I'm sure a lot of you will be interested in. And I'm also familiar with the book that is cited here, the one called Biology of Doom by Ed Regis, which is also a very good book I can recommend. But if you want a tour de force on CIA and military involvement in biological warfare and in mind control and associate investigations by the CIA and the military, then you can't go wrong by getting this book that we're going to be discussing today, A Terrible Mistake, The Murder of Frank Olson. So without any further ado, I'm going to bring Hank on the line. Hank, are you there?
I'm here.
Hi. Thank you for joining us today. I just want to tell you that your book is very fascinating. Of course, in light of a lot of the material that has been released, whether willingly or unwillingly by the CIA and the military over the years through Freedom of Information Act, has revealed a lot of very shadowy programs that were run by the CIA and the military, especially regarding chemical weapons and mind control research. And it seems as though Frank Olson is sort of like a central character in a lot of this stuff. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about how you got interested in Frank Olson's case and eventually what led you to write the book that you did.
Sure. A lot of it, there's actually a detailed account in the book itself, but I can give you a sort of abbreviated version. In 1975, some of the details concerning Olson's death were initially inadvertently revealed through a report that was released to the public by the Rockefeller Commission, which had been appointed by President Gerald Ford to supposedly investigate the domestic abuses of the Central Intelligence Agency in the United States. And within that report, there were a number of violations of the CIA's charter that were cited, and one of them that was just briefly noted were the drug programs that were operated by the CIA in the early 50s and through to about the end of the 1960s. And one paragraph that dealt with that mentioned very briefly, without naming the person, mentioned that a scientist who had been employed by the U.S. Army at Fort Detrick had committed suicide as a result of being dosed with LSD by the CIA at a retreat in a remote area of Maryland. And that was 1975. That was, I think, that report came out around June 14th of 1975, and I was living in Washington D.C. at that point in time. I was going to graduate school, and shortly thereafter, I ended up working in the White House about a year and a half later in the White House for the Carter administration. But I'd always been curious about the case of Frank Olson. When it was initially revealed that he had been dosed with LSD, of course, there was a lot of press coverage, and there was a fair amount of mention of the CIA's mind control programs, but not a lot of details. But the thing that bothered me about Olson's death was that nobody really questioned the few details that the CIA had released, and to me it just simply didn't make sense that a man of Olson's position, who was more than familiar with the effects of drugs and of drugs that were being researched by the CIA in Fort Detrick, would have committed suicide, especially with no history of psychological disturbance on his part. So I did a little research at that time, and about a year or two later, John Marks's book came out, The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, and within that book was probably the most detailed article or chapter that had been released or published on Frank Olson, and I pretty much devoured that chapter and marked it up extensively, and noted that it really raised far more questions, I thought, than it answered. But still, I didn't have time to really at that juncture to pursue the case. But years later, I had moved from D.C. to a small area outside of Baltimore, Maryland, called Catonsville, Maryland. And through a series of odd quirks, I became aware of the fact that the CIA and the Army had conducted experiments at a mental institution that was located right on the edge of that town called Spring Grove. It was formerly called the Maryland Psychiatric Institute, and it had been there since, I think the early 1800s. It was one of the oldest insane asylums in the United States. And I thought that was pretty fascinating. I wasn't aware of the fact that the CIA and the Army had conducted experiments at mental hospitals. And basically through a series of luck, when visiting the mental institution, Spring Grove, I became aware of the fact that various people from the Army and from Olson's research laboratory at Detrick had visited Spring Grove fairly extensively in the early 1950s, prior to his death in 1953. There were actually some logbooks where he had signed in, and other people associated with him and both the CIA had signed in, just by name, not by notation of who they were affiliated with. So that really piqued that had the result of really piquing my curiosity, and at that point I decided to really dig into the case, and with the objective of maybe writing a 10,000-word article, but that expected exercise turned into a 10-year, basically a 10-year project where research led to more research, and I became, I guess you could say, fairly obsessed with the story, and decided I wanted to really dig into it and detail the whole story, and early on I was very suspicious of the fact that what the CIA claimed to be a fact that he committed suicide just didn't make sense, and I was thoroughly convinced he had been murdered, but at that point in time I had no proof whatsoever, and it really had no clue as to the extent and the complexity of the programs that the CIA was operating at that time and that Olson was involved in.
Yes, indeed. The first time I think I ever came across the story of Frank Olson was I believe it was a made-for-TV movie that was produced about this, and I can't remember what year that was. Perhaps you're familiar with it.
There's quite a few over the years since 1975. Over the years, TV. There's been a lot of televised reports on Olson, but I don't recall. I don't recall a movie. I certainly haven't seen everything, and I know his death was somewhat depicted in oh God, what's the movie? The Robert De Niro, Matt Damon movie, The Good Shepherd. But that was sort of a veiled depiction of his death.
Perhaps it was only a peripheral story in another movie. I seem to have a recollection of that, but I cannot recall any more details about the movie. But it seems that I have a memory of coming across something like that, which first brought his name.
I'm sure there was something, and I have a videotape of I think about 23 segments that were aired on ABC, CBS, and NBC over the years, and they pretty faithfully went back to the case and raised all the appropriate questions. Didn't answer any of them, but underscored the complexity of the case and the fact that it really remained a mystery.
Yes, indeed. What's really interesting about this and the CIA's involvement in all this is that they eventually adopted the attitude of supporting the idea of paying a settlement to the family, but they were unwilling to accept any responsibility for anything. Ultimately,
that's absolutely correct. That what they refused to accept any responsibility. They stuck to the story, the conventional story that he had committed suicide. They admitted to the fact that employees for the agency had participated in drugging him, but oddly never explained why. And the press oddly never pressed them for an explanation, but I think the thing that did a fair amount of damage in terms of going forward with an investigation was the fact that the family, in return for accepting $750,000 from the U.S. government, had to also sign a pretty ironclad agreement that they would never in the future bring additional action against the government concerning Olson's death, unless they could definitively prove fraud on the part of the government, and that kind of that kind of action is really, really hard to revamp and bring against the government. And establishing fraud, when there's virtually no witnesses whatsoever, is equally hard. And then all the documentation you're dealing with, the government controls. So Eric Olson, Frank Olson's oldest son, always suspected, rightfully so, that his father had been murdered, but was unable to convince his mother not to accept the settlement. And even I spent a lot of time interviewing and talking with the Olson attorneys who in 1976 negotiated that settlement, and they did a wonderful job. But what hadn't been revealed at that point in time is, even though they were, aggressively negotiating on the part of the family, behind the scenes, the attorneys were telling the family that they were advising the family that they shouldn't settle. The attorneys thought they were in a really good position to really get to the bottom of what had happened to Olson, and to really do a full-blown expose on the programs he was involved in, and the programs that the CIA and the Army were jointly cooperating on. But Alice Olson, Frank Olson's wife, who was the matriarch of the family at that point in time, just put her foot down and said that she had had enough. I suspected, and I more or less imply this in the book, but I didn't want to go too far with it because I didn't know, and Alice Olson unfortunately was dead. But I suspected through a thorough reading of the investigatory files that the CIA maintained on Olson's death, that Alice Olson probably knew a little bit more than she ever let on. There was one document that was pretty revealing, that explained when Olson was initially taken to New York City to see a psychiatrist, Harold Abramson, and it was in New York that he died. Alice Olson actually rode in the automobile with him to the CIA headquarters, where he then went to National Airport in D.C. and flew to New York. And the report made a point of stating that when Olson arrived at CIA headquarters, he asked to be left alone with his wife in the car for 15 minutes so he could talk to her. And so I always suspected that he probably came clean with his wife and explained some things to her. But of course, she was a loyal wife, and it was actually a violation of his security oath with the Army and the CIA to reveal anything at all, even to his wife. So I had a great deal of respect for her. She never let on that had happened, assuming that it had happened. But I think one can make a strong case that's what did happen, and that's why she put her foot down and decided on behalf of the family to take the $750,000.
And that was actually ended up being a lot less than their original request, and even the one that's referred to in a couple of the memos that you have reproduced on your website at albarelli.net, where
right, actually the original settlement, I think, was in the neighborhood of I think $1.2 million, which was quite a bit more than $750,000, but and of course that had to be approved through an act of Congress. You can't sue the government, and the government can't agree to settle without Congress, literally Congress signing off on it through legislative action. But what happened at the last minute with the Olsons is there was a congressman from, I can't think of his name right now. There was a congressman from California who was an arch conservative, and I think he was very, very active in the John Birch Society, who at the last minute refused to vote in favor of the settlement, and any settlement has to be unanimously approved by Congress, and so there were some quick huddles held and between the White House and the White House attorneys and the Olson attorneys, and this man eventually said he would agree to the settlement if it were whittled down beneath the figure of $1 million, and it ended up at $750,000, and he signed off on it. But for a while, it looked like the family was going to get nothing. The attorneys weren't upset about that. I think they could have turned that into a real public relations coup, but again, Alice Olson, wanted them to do everything possible to get a settlement.
Yes. Well, I think your speculation regarding, his possibly coming clean with some of the stuff that he was involved with to his wife is probably accurate. It may also indicate that he reckoned that he was at that point in some measure of trouble.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. That he knew he was in serious trouble, and he probably didn't suspect at that time that he was going to be killed, but I think he realized that the game was up, and at the very least, because they were taking him to see a psychiatrist in New York, and actually the psychiatrist they took him to was somebody he knew fairly well, and that he had worked with during the Second World War at Detrick in Edgewood Arsenal. But by knowing he was being taken to a psychiatrist, it was pretty obvious that there was going to be a finding that he had psychological problems and would be institutionalized. And I think the plan was to do just that, and then and he was going to be institutionalized in Maryland at a private facility called Chestnut Lodge that the CIA used extensively. And I think once he checked in there, in my view, it would have been doubtful that he would have ever checked out. The only reason he was killed in New York, because it made no sense whatsoever to kill him in New York. It was really a high-risk action. But the other thing is he became aware of the fact that he was going to be taken to Chestnut Lodge in Maryland, and he didn't want to go, and he actually literally tried to escape a couple times in New York, just to flee and get away, and on at least two occasions begged his minders, who was an officer from Fort Detrick and an official from the CIA, just to let him go. And it was really sort of pathetic to read the files. He said, "Just let me go, I'll disappear, and you'll never hear of me again." And of course, they weren't willing to do that.
Naturally, it's too much information embedded in him to
Right.
allow him to go. And
That's for sure.
Yeah, they're notorious. CIA and military are both notorious for an unwillingness to leave people out of their control, especially whenever they're involved in very sensitive projects, which of course Olson was.
Yeah, you couldn't. I mean, the projects he was involved in were ultra sensitive. They couldn't be much more sensitive, and they didn't want any of that getting out. That would have been any of that getting out in 1952 or 1953 would have been absolutely disastrous to the U.S. government, because the Soviets would have latched onto it right away and had a propaganda field day with it, and would have done serious damage. So
indeed, and even later on, whenever some of this information did look like it was going to come out, you had the wholesale shredding of material, to keep most all of this stuff from the public's knowledge.
Right, there was a tremendous amount of material concerning the mind control programs, the MK-ULTRA programs, and some of the other MK programs from the 50s that were, I think there were 40 cartons or 43 cartons of documents that were burned at a CIA facility in West Virginia, one of their records facilities, and God only knows what was in those documents. Fortunately, they overlooked the fact that there were a lot of financial documents that survived that burning, and some of those financial documents actually had project reports or status reports attached to them, and remarkably they overlooked that, which kind of begs the question, how thorough are they really? But so in the mid 70s, when John Marks came along and did a Freedom of Information request, that's what he ended up with, about 20,000 documents, 20,000 pages of documents concerning the MK-ULTRA programs, and those documents taken as a whole were very, very revealing as to what was going on, but there's huge gaps in terms of putting that puzzle together. There's a lot of projects where there's no records whatsoever, and again, that just covers the MK-ULTRA program, and there are a lot of other programs that we know absolutely nothing about.
And whenever Marx's book came out, it was highly censored by the CIA, the original edition.
Yeah, they weren't. Well, Marx actually had worked for the State Department. They weren't real happy about his book at all. But what's interesting, it's odd. The book was his book is excellent, but the book was sort of a minor sensation. The expectation was that when it came out, it would be shocking, and that the public would have a much stronger reaction, and that the book would have sold much better than it did. It has sold very well over the years, and it still sells, at a pretty steady pace. But it never met the expectations of the publisher. And I think the reason for that is real simple. I think most Americans, most average Americans don't want to know about these programs because, and there's a good reason for that, because knowing, and understanding what the government is doing in that regard is, at the very least, makes one feel pretty helpless. There's not much you can do to defend against it or to change it, other than, what we're always told. You can go to the ballot box and vote, but it's pretty rare when anybody's running for high public office in this country to see anybody lock horns with the CIA, especially today. Most people in Congress, I interviewed a number of Congress people just trying to get basic information about the relationship between Congress and the CIA for my book, and without exception, I was told by there was maybe 4 Congress people that I interviewed that they weren't interested in knowing the details of what the CIA did, or how much money went to it, or how many employees they had, and that the mindset was really, it was a liability to know too much about the agency, and I think that kind of mindset still exists today. There's a real reluctance, in a lot of cases fear, to take on the CIA, because I don't think people want to suffer the possible consequences.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think you're very very correct whenever you say that a lot of people are afraid to find out this knowledge because, of course, the government, especially now with the implementation of Homeland Security and all this idea about homegrown terror and everything else, a lot of people feel powerless already against the government, and knowing that they're involved in some of this research would just make it that much worse. And I think a lot of people want to avoid that. Yeah, they don't want to know how bad it can get, because it's already bad enough with the encroachment on civil liberties and privacy that we have now. They don't want to think about it being worse than it is.
No, and it is pretty bad now. I mean, it's I think in a lot of ways our democracy is very much threatened. And I think there were high expectations that maybe Obama was going to change a lot of the overreaction to the 9/11 attacks, but that just hasn't been the case, and I guess basically Obama, it's Congress that really bears a responsibility to change that. I mean, they're the ones that approved and created that homeland monster that we all have to contend with, and now it's so entrenched. I don't know if it'll ever be gone. It's just the Transportation Security Administration alone is a massive agency, and it employs so many people that if that were to be closed down, the unemployment rate would shoot up a few points right away.
Yeah, it's like it's like an old adage they say about taxes. If they institute a new tax, no matter what they tell you it's for, it's just to pay for this particular thing, and then it'll go away. It never goes away. We still have the
toll roads,
right? Just to pay for its construction, right? And here in Pennsylvania, I'm in Pennsylvania. We have a town, Johnstown, that was flooded a long time ago, and they still have a tax. They still have a flood tax there. Once it was put in, they just keep collecting it. So the bureaucracy just stays in place. So now, Olson worked at Fort Detrick, and Fort Detrick was the military's chemical weapons testing facility, or at least one of them.
It was the central research location. It's a massive installation. for both chemical and biological warfare, and I'm not sure, I can't remember now. It's hundreds and hundreds of acres. It's just massive, and it's very, very secure. And there's that for research in chemical and biological warfare. And then there's a lot that's also conducted nearby at Edgewood Arsenal, and a lot of the chemical and biological weapons are stored at Edgewood Arsenal. So there's a good interchange of projects and personnel between both facilities, but they're both massive. Edgewood Arsenal is, I think, 2,000 or 3,000 acres that stretches all the way down to Chesapeake Bay, and most people are completely unaware of what goes on at either location.
Indeed. A strange little story that I could relate to you, a weird coincidence, I guess you could call it. A friend of mine, he has a relative who, now, one of Frank's sons is a dentist, is he not?
Yeah, Nils Olson.
Yeah,
he's a dentist in Frederick, Maryland. Yeah.
Yes, my friend has a family member. I can't remember if it's his cousin or something to that effect. It has him as their dentist. And,
sure.
Yeah. He found he actually heard a little bit about the story of Frank Olson through his family, having known the son as him being their dentist. One thing that he did bring up that maybe you might have some comment on, he said that they, in talking about Fort Detrick, he said that people who live in that area, they note that there seems to be a proliferation of albino animals, particularly albino deer, that they see frequently in and around the Fort Detrick facility.
Yeah, that's not. I hadn't been. I was aware of that in terms of Edgewood Arsenal, and so it makes perfect sense that it's it also is happening at Fort Detrick. No, that makes perfect sense because they're basically working with every exotic chemical and biological substance known to man, and so there's bound to be disastrous effects or byproducts from that, and Detrick since the mid 1940s on has always maintained a huge farm in which they raise practically every farm animal you can think of: cows, sheep, pigs, and a lot of monkeys. They were probably, for years and years, they were the biggest importer of rhesus monkeys from South America and Latin America, and literally went through thousands of monkeys every year. And the monkeys were used as research subjects and killed in massive numbers, as were the farm animals. And there's a fair amount of animals that are kept at Edgewood Arsenal too. The other big problem, it's bad enough to conduct the wholesale slaughter of defenseless animals, but the other big problem that's emerging in the last couple of years at Fort Detrick is the rate of cancer among people that live in and around Fort Detrick, especially children. And there's been some research conducted over the last couple of years, and they're finding that the incidence of cancer is just astronomically high when compared to other areas. And it makes perfect sense in terms of how how in a lot of cases the storage of chemicals and the security of chemicals and biological agents over the years has been reported to be pretty lackadaisical, and they often do inventories there to account for the massive amounts of chemical and biological substances they have, and it's not uncommon to see in the newspaper, maybe every other year that massive amounts of these substances turn up missing, and they just can't account for them. One of the interesting things that was revealed when the FBI was doing the investigation into the anthrax mailings on Capitol Hill, which happened at the same time at 9/11, and they actually targeted a couple Detrick employees before they came to the conclusion that the Ivans, Dr. Ivans, who killed himself a few years ago, was the anthrax mailer. I think there's a lot of doubt about that, but they had targeted a couple other individuals early on. Oh, I can't remember their name. That one man whose career was virtually destroyed, but
that was Stephen Hatfield, I think.
Yeah, Hatfield. Yeah, and he successfully sued them recently and ended up with millions in terms of a settlement because what was done to him was just inexcusable. I mean, they basically told the New York Times that he was the guy, and the Times. It's kind of hard to believe, splashed that all over the newspaper and had top scientists vouching for the fact that Hatfield was the anthrax mailer. Well, as it turned out, he wasn't. But in the process of the FBI and the Army and Fort Detrick investigators pursuing Hatfield, what was revealed was that they drained a number of the ponds and swamps around Fort Detrick that Hatfield also lived nearby, and they were looking for maybe evidence that would connect him to the anthrax mailing. They didn't find any evidence that connected him, but what they did find, almost without exception, in all the small bodies of water they drained was all kinds of residue from Fort Detrick. That there were vials of deadly chemicals and containers of deadly biological substances, and somebody had dumped all this stuff in these small ponds and swamps.
Yes,
it was just amazing, and that was actually reported in the newspapers, and remarkably, nobody seemed to get alarmed about it at all.
I remember.
So if there's albino animals, it shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone.
Well, I guess now that you put it that way, I mean, I guess that makes perfect sense. Interestingly, you talked about the incidence of cancer being really high around those areas, and that brought to mind the work that was done by what's her name, Mary.
The woman in New Orleans.
Yeah.
Yeah, Mary. I can't think of her name either. I know exactly who you mean, though. Yeah.
Yeah, and
I'm not real familiar with that story. I know that I've got some questions about it in terms of how it's presented in the book that concerns her, and I think it's Lee Harvey Oswald.
Right.
That book either, but
right.
Is it Sherman? Mary Sherman?
I think it is Mary Sherman. Yeah. Now that you say that,
but
yeah.
She. There's no doubt at all that she was a very prestigious cancer researcher, and she worked with top authorities in the field in New Orleans at Tulane, and she died a very, very odd death. I mean, nobody can account for it. Even the police department down there, it just sort of baffles everybody. But I suspect that the portion of that story that concerns her probably having some involvement with government or CIA research is true. But I have a lot of questions about David Ferrie and Lee Harvey Oswald being involved in that. I just don't see enough evidence to convince me that that's the case. David Ferry, I mean, it is well documented that he conducted some of his own research on mice he kept in his apartment, but it was pretty crude, unsophisticated research, even though he was a fairly smart guy. And I just find it hard to imagine that the Army and or the CIA would have a guy like him keeping mice in his apartment and doing experiments. I mean, they're a little more sophisticated than that. And
yeah, I think so.
he may have known about certain things. She certainly did. And I think that's a story that still deserves, like thorough investigation. But I'm not sure. So much time has passed, and I think the agency and the Army have learned their lessons about destroying documents.
Yes.
But maybe someday something will come out. I think it would be fascinating to know what really happened to her.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I didn't want to get sidetracked into that whole book and everything over there in that issue. The only thing that I wanted to bring up was the point that they were working with viruses there, and they were looking at a viral connection to cancer, and that's not generally recognized by mainstream science, that there is a bacterial or viral connection to cancer.
It's not at all. And actually, it's in my book. It's a number of Army documents are cited that while Olson was alive and active at Camp Detrick, he and a number of colleagues engaged a lot of research concerning cancer. But what they were trying to do, at the request of the CIA, was develop the means to induce cancer, certain types of cancer in people, and the record clearly shows through some of the documents that I was able to obtain that they successfully developed the ability to do that. Now it wasn't detailed how they were able to do it. The thing that was part of the details, and the details were sketchy, that was that they could do it through basically a pinprick. But what type of cancer and how fast acting the cancer was wasn't spelled out in the records I saw. But they clearly did spend a lot of time on that, and they were very, very pleased when they were successful doing that. I guess that would account for a lot of the monkeys they basically slaughtered, and perhaps people too. There was a tremendous amount of cancer research, all sorts of cancer research that was conducted by the Army and the Air Force and the CIA after the Second World War in Texas at a number of the military hospitals there, and they actually brought in 2 or 3 former Nazi scientists to assist with that. And
great idea.
In one case at Sam Houston Hospital, which is on military base there, they conducted extensive experiments with terminal cancer patients to see how much radiation they could actually tolerate, and the objective of the experiment wasn't to see how much they could tolerate in terms of curing cancer. The objective was simply to see how much radiation the human body could absorb before death occurred, and the results of that experiment were that 285 service people who had terminal cancer died as a result of those experiments, and they admit to that today. They regret it, and the excuse the excuse that's used is well, these people would have died anyway, but who knows? It says who,
Right.
And so a lot of that stuff went on unknown to anyone, and at that point in time, in the 50s and 60s, a lot of knowledge was being gained, but we weren't. This country, in terms of medical research, wasn't anywhere near as sophisticated as it is today, and in another 50 years, we can say the same thing about today. But for the government to willingly used unwitting human subjects really calls into question, what the hell is going on?
Oh my
especially
God,
with
yes.
service people. But that happened a lot. That happened an awful lot.
Maybe everybody should just take a couple seconds who's listening here just to let that sink in that the Army was successful in being able to induce cancer in people via a pinprick of some type, an introduction of something into their body. I think it's probably reasonable to assume that this was some sort of viral vector.
Right.
Considering that they were working with bacteria and viruses and other types of transmissible diseases. And, of course, there's a large body of evidence to indicate that cancer does have a bacterial and or viral connection that mainstream medicine does not generally acknowledge. I think that that certainly shed some light on, people who came later, like Jack Ruby, who claimed to have been given cancer, while he was in jail. And of course, you can't just automatically discount those stories. I mean, whenever you come across,
not when you know they have that, not when you know they have that ability.
My God, it's
not at all. And then the other thing that's equally frightening, or actually far more frightening, is that, and you can go to the congressional record to see this, is that a lot of the research the Army was doing at that time, and then later in the mid-'70s, really, the way they accounted for it and explained it to various congressional committees, it sounded very much like what they were trying to develop was an AIDS-type form of cancer. And if you look at some of the hearings on that, you'll see that, they pretty much explain that they were trying to develop AIDS without using the word AIDS, because it wasn't in use at that point in time.
Right.
And explained they wanted $10 million from Congress through an appropriation, which Congress did approve, and I think that was 1978. And they said, and we expect fully to have this developed within 10 years, and that takes us right up to the time when AIDS started spreading, wildly across America. So, and that's just looking at the congressional record. That's no speculation. That's no, no theories, nothing else. That's just looking at what the military was stating for the record to the Congressional Armed Forces Appropriation Committee, and they don't explain it. If you ask these people, they say, "Well, yeah, but that wasn't AIDS. That was something else." What's the something else? It's absurd.
Yes, that particular appropriation bill, I recall quite clearly, said that they were looking to create a disease which is refractory to the immune system. In other words, it was a disease that attacked the immune system, which is exactly what AIDS does. Yeah.
Exactly. And I don't know if they used the term retrovirus at that. I'm not sure. I don't think they did at that point in time. It was later. But yeah, that's exactly what they did. They said they wanted to develop a disease that attacked the human immune system. And well, what is that? We all know what that is.
That's right.
You can't really distinguish between that and the diseases we're grimly familiar with today.
Exactly, and of course, a lot of the people who are a little bit older listening would certainly remember when AIDS first showed up on the scene and became such a big social issue. One of the first things that one of the first conspiracy theories, if you want to call them that came up about where AIDS originated from was that it was the Soviet Union actually made the implication that the United States developed this as a weapon, and
they put out a fair amount of material on that.
Yes, they did.
Yeah. But the other thing I found really interesting about the whole AIDS outbreak, and I guess it could be just coincidental, but when AIDS first reared its ugly head in America. The two joint epicenters of AIDS were San Francisco and New York, and coincidentally, those were when the CIA was doing its MKULTRA. At the peak of that program with Fort Detrick, both those locations, New York and San Francisco, were the epicenters of those programs. So it seems to be a hell of a coincidence.
Yeah, it is.
That it happened, that both cities just were so strongly involved in both both incidents.
Yes, we had, of course, the release of the supposedly non-toxic bacteria in San Francisco.
Right. Yeah, and Olson was very much part of that experiment. He was actually on board one of the ships that partook in that experiment.
Yes.
And that was one of the things. He had a lot of knowledge about that. I think they sincerely believed at that point in time that the substance they were using was harmless. But if you look at the record for that period of time, there were ample reports that had been published by the Army stating very matter-of-factly that substance was not harmless, and that they knew it to be very harmful to humans. So it makes you really wonder who was calling the shots and who was really examining these experiments.
Right, and I think that one could easily make the assumption that they really didn't give a damn one way or the other whether it was harmful or not. They wanted to conduct their experiment.
Yeah, I think the priority was to conduct the experiments, and if there was what's the term, collateral damage, then
yes,
so be it.
Yes, and I think there was at least one confirmed death from there was. Bacteria released in San Francisco.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. That person, I can't remember his name. It's actually mentioned in my book, but that person died, and I think there were 3 or 4 other suspected deaths at the same approximate time, and that were revealed years later. And I don't know if those families sued or what the outcome of that was, but the names of those people were released publicly and reported in newspapers at that time, especially in the San Francisco area.
And of course, when you mentioned how both New York and San Francisco were hotbeds for CIA and military, both for the CIA had safe houses in San Francisco, I believe, that were run by George Hunter White.
Yeah, they had in all in New York they had basically one safe house prior to Olson's death, and as a result of Olson's death, that safe house, it was in Greenwich Village on Bedford Street. The building it was in, it was at 81 Bedford Street. That building is now gone. For some reason, it was torn down, and that would be worth looking into, is exactly why they tore it down and what the ownership of that building was. It's I did a little research into it, and the reports were that some sort of mysterious Frenchman who was involved in the export-import business owned the building, but nobody quite knew who he was, and the ownership records are really, really vague, and a lot of them are missing. But that was the New York safe house, and again, it was right in Greenwich Village, and which was really a perfect location for it. In San Francisco, they actually had, I think there were 3 or 4 safe houses, and one of them was actually in Marin County later on. But George White oversaw all of those safe houses. He was the person directly responsible, but there were a number of CIA people who were in and out of those safe houses on a routine basis, and the only reason we know that, and again, it's sort of a screw up on the part of the CIA, was that George White, for all the years that he worked for the CIA, secretly worked for the CIA, which was approximately, I think, a little over 12 years, kept a daily diary, and the diaries are. It takes a while to master the deciphering of his handwriting, but there's just some incredible things that are in the diary. But the main thing that I tracked and then I kept a list was the for 1951 through 58, the number of times that Sidney Gottlieb and Robert Lashbrook, two CIA officials who were very much involved in Olson's death, were in and out of those safe houses, and it was primarily one or the other was visiting the safe houses almost on a weekly basis. Even though when they testified before Congress, they said they had little to no knowledge of them. But if you look at White's diary, there's constant notations that say, pick Gottlieb up at airport at such and such a time, and then 2 days later it's like drop Gottlieb off at airport, and then Lashbrook at 81 Bedford Street, and there's just citation after citation after citation, and so there's no doubt that the CIA, various CIA officials were in and out of those safe houses all the time, and it wasn't just Gottlieb and Lashbrook. There were quite a number of people, and a lot of federal narcotics people were also very much knowledgeable of the safe houses, as were a number of fairly prominent people in the media at that point in time. White actually had a few people with the media come in and observe some of the LSD experiments he conducted on various people in the New York safe house. There was one reporter. It's mentioned in the book who a Pulitzer Prize winning reporter, a guy called Ed Reed, who wrote a lot of real classics on organized crime in America in the 1950s, and worked for I think the newspaper was the Brooklyn Eagle, which was a pretty prominent newspaper in the 50s in the New York area. But Ed Reed and George White were very, very close, and Reed was very knowledgeable about what was going on at the New York safe houses, and there's probably it's probably lost in time and history, but I think there were far more LSD experiments conducted by George White on known gangsters than we're aware of. And actually, a couple of those gangsters ended up being murdered at about the same time that Olson was killed. So I suspect that that those gangsters also knew that they had been experimented on and probably weren't very happy about it. I mean, it's very difficult to drop LSD on someone and not have them aware that something is going on.
Yeah, I would think
at some
so.
point,
Yes.
and even a day later. And I would guess some of the gangsters that White was dealing with weren't happy about it. There was one guy, Eugene Giannini, who was a very, very prominent gangster in the 50s and heroin trafficker, but he was also an informer, according to White's diaries, to both the Federal Narcotics Bureau and the CIA, and he delivered a lot of information to both agencies, especially overseas in France and Italy, and he died the same year as Frank Olson. He was shot down in Harlem early one morning on the street, and the murder officially has never been solved. There's a lot of speculation about, I'm sure there were stories planted by the government that this person or that person killed him, And interestingly enough, he was a very close associate with Joe Valachi, who later, about 10 years later,
infamous,
became the mouthpiece for the government about the mafia. So no, there's some real interesting stories there.
Yeah, quite a big connection. A lot of webs that intertwine with each other.
Yeah.
You mentioned Sidney Gottlieb. Of course, he's infamous for being involved with MKULTRA and mind control experimentation. That's probably where people most know him from now.
Right.
At Detrick, they mostly focused on chemical weapons, but there was a lot of crossover between these different programs, wasn't there?
Yeah, Detrick. Well, initially Detrick did almost exclusively worked with chemicals, only because around the time of the Second World War and after, there wasn't a lot of knowledge yet built up about biological weapons, and there was a real reluctance on the part of the government and a number of top-ranking administrators to go down that road, because it was like, in some ways, it was like nuclear power. Nuclear weapons, rather. They just didn't know, what kind of genie they were letting out of the bottle, and whether or not they could put it back in. But eventually, and this was about the time that Olson died. Researchers at Fort Detrick made the transition from focusing almost exclusively on chemical warfare, shifted over to biological warfare, because there was a perception that it could be much more effective, and especially in terms of wiping out large segments of the population, or entire small or medium-sized countries, and that was the objective with a lot of that. And so there were all kinds of diseases being experimented upon with animals, and there were some limited experiments that were conducted against other countries. There were a number of, over the years, a number of attacks on Cuba, and with the wiping out the tobacco crop in Cuba, which they very effectively did. At one point in time, the best tobacco in the world came from Cuba, but after the CIA was finished with that country, after Castro took over, the tobacco crop was almost wiped out. And then the other big agricultural industry in Cuba after Castro took over was the raising of swine or hogs for pork, and we launched a swine fever attack on Cuba that basically decimated the swine population of that island. And there was just a lot of that stuff that was going on constantly, in nearly all of those attacks and assaults on foreign countries. The weaponry used originated out of Fort Detrick. That was just, that was their charge. That was their responsibility. And for the 3 years prior to his death, Olson actually was stationed at Fort Detrick, but he worked almost exclusively for the CIA, and he worked under a code name. It was an MK code name, but it was MK-NAOMI as opposed to MKULTRA, and that was MK-NAOMI was just a designation for the relationship between Fort Detrick and the CIA. But if you look at there's a few surviving documents concerning MK-NAOMI, so we know it existed, and we know Olson was a part of it. But almost without exception, all of those documents that give sort of a sketchy description of the program state very matter-of-factly that anyone engaged in MK-NAOMI was not to keep copious records or any records at all. Because the agency just didn't want anything out there allowing people to to track those projects or programs, and therefore the relationship between Detrick and Olson's division, which was called the Special Operations Division, was very, very close, because by not keeping records, it was almost required that they had to meet on a fairly regular basis, and it was at one of those meetings 9 days before Olson's death that Olson was dosed with LSD. A conventional story that's given, through the Rockefeller Commission report and to the newspapers and the public at large, and in the mid-70s, was that Olson and a number of other people at the meeting were given LSD sort of as a practical joke, and I think that's pretty remarkable that everybody that the media just swallowed that, that here you've got high-ranking Central Intelligence Agency medical authorities like Sidney Gottlieb and Robert Lashbrook, and they're charged with developing, biological warfare weapons and programs for the United States government, and they're out in the woods in Maryland one night, and they have a glass of wine or two, and they decide, well, let's dose all our buddies with LSD, and that never sat well with me at all. It just, I knew, these weren't the type of men that did that, and that's, again, goes to the reason why I pursued the Olson story. But as it turns out, there was no doubt that Olson was dosed with LSD, but it wasn't as part of a lark or a jokester type prank, but he was dosed with LSD because at that point in time it was common to use LSD in interrogation programs that were conducted by the CIA under the label of the Artichoke Project, and Olson actually was part and parcel with the Artichoke Project and was a participant in what they called the Artichoke Conference, which was also alternatively called the Artichoke Committee, which was a group of scientists that met weekly with the CIA to review the development of enhanced interrogation programs. And so ironically, when the CIA became aware of the fact that Olson wanted to leave the employ of the CIA and the Army, and he wanted to retrain himself as a dentist. And it was actually Alice Olson that revealed that, and I guess that, in large part, led his younger son Nils in that direction. But when that was revealed to the CIA that, hey, Frank Olson, wants out, he wants to quit, and by the way, he's also has some loose lips, and he's talking a lot about some of these programs that he's involved with. Alarm bells went off, and he was the reason he was given LSD at the meeting was to interrogate him, to do damage assessment and figure out, well, how bad is this going to get? Because just a few days later he was taken to New York. So it all, as the story finally started to emerge, it made perfect sense.
I think that it could have been also been an objective to destabilize Olson as well. To put him on the path.
Definitely to destabilize him that night. There was no doubt about it. But if you go by the record, and I tend to think a lot of the documents concerning that meeting are probably true. He was only given, I think it was 70 or 80 micrograms of LSD, and that's a relatively small amount. That's enough to throw somebody, off balance and to make them uncomfortable, and probably a pretty good interrogation subject to work with. But it's not enough to really affect anybody's mental capacities or to drive them to suicide or even hallucinations. I mean, it's sort of low on the count for for an LSD trip, and so I guess the point is to swallow the story that 9 days later Olson acted insanely and ran across the room in his underwear and dove through a window in the dark.
Right.
It just doesn't.
No,
it
doesn't
wash at all. How he found that window is, I've been in that room. It's just, it would have been impossible to do what the government claims he did.
And plus, there was a radiator right in front of it, so
two beds.
Yeah,
two beds.
crashing through it. I mean, that's a feat.
Mm-hmm.
It's a feat to do it on your own.
The fact that the window was closed and there was a canvas shade drawn and cloth curtains. So, again, and supposedly it happened in the dark. So.
And the guy sleeping in a room with him never noticed anything.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And that was Robert Lashbrook, who was second in charge of the MKULTRA program with Sid Gottlieb.
Yes, and when I brought up the idea of destabilizing, I think that as you've indicated in your research, I think that Olson was a really tightly wound individual, and I think people
he was a very high-strung individual, and the only reason I know that is I interviewed enough people who worked with him, and it's interesting. A lot of people didn't like him at all because not only was he high-strung, but he was I don't really know why, he was fairly arrogant and outspoken, and oddly enough he didn't react well at all ever to military authority. There were a number of incidents that took place with him at the main gate going into Detrick, and he just really resented having to stop all the time and showing, his credentials or ID, and got cited a number of times for being really obstinate and refusing to do that. So. He obviously had a very, very strong personality, and I think bottom line really wasn't suited to work for either the military or the CIA or U.S. government. He would have been, I think, much better off in the private sector where he didn't have to be that respectful of authority.
Yes. Well, of course, I think that even a small dose of LSD would be enough to, make someone who's really high-strung like that feel a little bit out of control themselves, and of course, this sets up the entire scenario for the CIA. So, here he is going crazy, etc. It probably would have. If it did anything, it probably would have made him more determined to get away, and because now it's proven to him beyond a doubt that they had targeted him and that they were going to do whatever they could to keep him quiet, etc. The fact that he was dosed, so and that probably would have solidified in his mind that he would do whatever he can to get out of that situation, and not by suicide, but by doing whatever he could to. Disappear or whatever he wanted
to do. There's also, if you look at the record real closely, and I didn't speculate about this at all in the book, but if just by reading the record, one could easily come to a conclusion that while he was in New York, he was also being drugged somehow. I don't think he was being given LSD at all in New York, but I think he was being given something, and because he. According to the record, he actually remarked a couple of times that he didn't want to drink coffee. He didn't want to take an alcoholic drink with the people he was with because he was fearful that all the liquid he was being handed was spiked, and it probably was.
Yeah. Maybe with a tranquilizer or something.
Yeah, I would suspect that. We know through the record that the first night he was in New York that Dr. Abramson came to the hotel room with an odd combination of medication. He brought a bottle of bourbon a few capsules of Nebutol to give to Olson, and a lot of people have remarked, and correctly so, that Nebutol, which is a very strong sleeping pill, really doesn't mix well with alcohol at all. It could be extremely dangerous. Yet that's what he gave Olson. And according to the record, Olson had a drink and took, I think it was 2 Nebutol capsules, but yet the record also says he got up in the middle of the night at about 3 or 4 in the morning. So you've got to really wonder, was it Nebutol that he gave him? Could it have been maybe an upper to just make him, even more agitated? I can't see someone, having a shot or 2 of bourbon and 2 Nebutols, waking up 3 or 4 hours later.
Right.
It just
that
doesn't make sense at all. I mean, you'd be like limp like a dish rag.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you. I think that we could speculate a lot about what he might have been given. The bottom line is that they were exercising whatever methods they could to keep him under control. And but do you have any? I don't recall if you speculated on this or in the book or not, but it seemed rather odd to me that when he was in New York and he went back to I guess
Maryland,
CIA back to Maryland, and they immediately turned around and went back to New York, and then of course death followed after that. What was the reason?
That story is very, very odd, and it's in the CIA records concerning his his final days when Lashbrook was with him. The reason people returned to Maryland from New York was Thanksgiving. It was actually Thanksgiving Day, and there were, let me see, with Olson there were 2 people. There was Rouette, Vincent Rouette, who was his boss at Fort Detrick, went with him to New York, and Robert Lashbrook. And Olson, according to the record, initially said he agreed to go to New York, but he wanted to be allowed to return to Maryland to be with his family for Thanksgiving, and again, according to the record, they agreed to that. And of course, both Lashbrook and Rouette they had families, and they wanted to be with their families for Thanksgiving. But the odd story, the thing that unfolded, and there's really no way to verify it because everyone involved is dead and was dead at the time except for Gottlieb, and he wasn't really involved except towards the end, and I'll get to that in a minute. But the story goes that they flew back to Washington D.C. They flew into National Airport, and Rouette, Olson's superior at Fort Detrick, and Olson were picked up by a driver from Fort Detrick to return them to their families. And about, I think it was a third of the way on the way back to Detrick, Olson asked Rouette to have the guy driving pull over somewhere in, I think in Rockville or I don't know, around Chevy Chase or wherever, near a department store, Woodward and Lothrop that used to be there, and said he wanted to talk to Rouette and asked the driver to get out of the car, which the driver did, and Olson said he had a change of mind, and he didn't want to go home for Thanksgiving because he was fearful that he would act out violently, which was really sort of strange. I mean, it kind of came out of the blue.
Right.
There wasn't much in the account that pointed to his acting that way. So Rouette made the decision, again according to the record, that Olson should probably go back to New York. But Rouette didn't want to go back to New York. He wanted to be with his family. So what happened is is they turned around and brought Olson to Robert Lashbrook's apartment near DuPont Circle in Washington D.C. and Lashbrook waited for Olson to come, and while he was waiting for Olson to come, he called his superior, Sidney Gottlieb, and Gottlieb came over, and Rouette soon thereafter dropped Olson off, and Gottlieb decided, well, Olson and Lashbrook should go back to New York immediately, which they did. But while, according to the account, while Olson was in Lashbrook's apartment near DuPont Circle, and after Gottlieb came, according to both Gottlieb and Lashbrook, Olson started to behave rather bizarrely, and according to them was doing very odd things like rolling around on the floor and doing somersaults and trying to stand on his head, and that's completely out of character with Olson, and perhaps that isn't true, and perhaps the whole account about returning to the D.C. and Frederick area is complete baloney. But there was no way to verify it, and the really perplexing thing for me was Olson's behavior. I mean, if indeed he was behaving like that, then obviously I think he was, again under the influence of maybe a much stronger drug.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe LSD again. I don't know what, but the thing that doesn't make any sense is he's behaving like that in Lashbrook's apartment, but a half hour later, Gottlieb's dropping him off with Lashbrook at National Airport, and they're getting on an airplane. It's a 2-hour flight, I think, at that point in time to New York City. So I don't think it doesn't make any sense that somebody would put a man acting that bizarrely on an airplane.
Exactly.
So that's
yeah.
a very perplexing part of the whole account, and there's nothing in it. The record continues. They flew back to New York. They got a cab and went to Abramson's house on Long Island and had dinner with Abramson, and then stayed in a bed and breakfast on Long Island. And the next morning, Abramson picked them up and drove them back into New York City, where he continued to allegedly treat Olson, and they checked back into the Statler Hotel, and then, of course, that night Olson allegedly committed suicide. So, I mean, in a period of 3 or 4 days, there was a lot happening, and they were going back and forth, and Olson was making all these visits to Abramson, and they even had time, according to the record, to go to a movie. They went to a war movie, and they went to a Broadway play. At the Broadway play, Olson became extremely paranoid and decided to leave at intermission because he was convinced that there were FBI agents in the audience and outside the theater ready to arrest him, and that's not explained either. Why? And that's actually in the record, where he told Rouette that I need to get out of here because they're here to arrest me. And so either that was some severe paranoia, or it was, the result of the fact that he knew they were on to him, and he thought, yes, I am going to be arrested, and he just couldn't, he couldn't get comfortable sitting watching a Broadway play. He couldn't get comfortable at all, basically doing anything, and was ill at ease, and so he was allowed to leave the play, but not alone, and was escorted back to the hotel. And of course, the whole time he was there, he was shadowed by a couple people that worked for George White, because George White was supposed to be involved in the whole scenario involving Olson in New York, but White's mother, and this is pretty well documented, White's mother unfortunately died in California that same week, and it was necessary for him to go and help his father, who was also very ill, to with the funeral arrangements. So George White sort of passed the assignment on to sort of a mysterious figure known as Pierre Lafitte, who was also a notorious drug trafficker, but who also worked covertly for the CIA and had been trained by the CIA after being recruited by White. So again, there was a lot going on in New York that nobody was, that nobody really understood. And certainly Frank Olson was the last person to know any of this was going on. Although one night when in New York, I think it was the first night or the second night he was there, he did flee the hotel. He managed to slip out of the room.
Yes.
Without Lashbrook or Ruette knowing it. Lashbrook was actually in an adjoining room, and the conventional story said he decided on his own to come back after throwing away all of his credentials in his wallet. But I think it's more than apparent that he was escorted back to the hotel.
Right.
And that his wallet and credentials were at that point in time taken away from him because they didn't want him to have any identification so that it would be harder if he tried to escape again, that to board a plane or to have any money or cash. It was much easier at that point in time to get on a plane. You really didn't even need to show an ID, but by stripping him of his wallet and all his credentials, it just made it all the more difficult.
Yeah, well, that particular instance you talk about, the very first thing I thought of was, here's a man who's trying to get away, for sure. I mean, he managed to slip past the people who were closest to him, but as you say,
right.
He had other people watching him, watching the hotel.
Yeah,
probably.
Absolutely.
He was probably intercepted immediately as soon as he got outside.
Yeah, he was.
Yeah,
he was, and even in Ruette, his superiors, his Ruette provided after Olson's suicide, provided the agency with an affidavit concerning his involvement, and he made it very clear that Olson, the first couple nights in New York, had literally begged him to let him go. To just he on the first occasion he asked Lashbrook to leave the room, and after Lashbrook left, Olson said to Ruette, "Look, you've got to let me go. I've got to get out of here, and just let me disappear, please, please." And of course, Ruette was loyal to the agency and the Army. He was I think at that point in time a lieutenant colonel, and he had. He expected to have quite a future with Fort Detrick, and he did. At one point in time, he was in charge of the entire installation. Not long after Olson's death, and he picked up a number of very lucrative consultancy contracts through the Army and the Pentagon, and I think those were very much awards for playing along and keeping his mouth shut.
Right.
About the whole Olson case.
Yes. And I think it's probably a sad statement of affairs to comment at this point that the actions involving Frank Olson and the terrible tragedy of his death is probably just one of many.
I think so. I think Olson's. It wasn't planned that Olson was going to die that way, because that was just too sloppy. And,
right.
And the agency was much more skilled in killing people even at that point in time than to kill him in that manner. But again, he was trying to get away, and things just got totally out of hand, and they had two people that were minding him that weren't as skilled as George White and in terms of handling people.
Yeah.
And Olson suffered the consequences. But does the agency do that? Yeah, of course they do. And they'll scoff at anybody that makes that charge against them. But at the same time that Olson died, and it's in the appendix of the book, the CIA had published privately among their own employees what they called the assassination manual.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, it was a multi-page, I think a 22, 23-page manual that explained how to kill people, how to do away with individuals that were bothersome. And one of the techniques that's laid out in a fair amount of detail is to drop somebody from a high place, from from a bridge or from a window in a hotel or the roof of a building, and then it goes on in terms of describing all sorts of means of killing people through surreptitiously, through drugs, through high-powered rifles, through this and through that. Well, they didn't go to the trouble of drawing up a comprehensive manual like that just so that people could sit around and read it and theoretically discuss it. I mean,
Indeed.
Obviously they were doing this on a regular basis, and one of the places they were most doing it at the time of Olson's death actually was in Guatemala with the whole United Fruit and
what a story that is.
Upheaval. Yeah, and that's the little we know about that's a remarkable story, but I think there's far I'd love to see somebody really dig into that, but we know for a fact that part of that manual was actually developed in response to what was going on in Guatemala, and the agency at that point in time was actually forming what they called K teams, and the K stood for kill, and that a massive amount of people, well, massive in terms of a few hundred, were actually assassinated as a result of the whole Guatemala upheaval involving United Fruit and the change in leadership. But there were several hundred people that were actually assassinated by these kill teams that had been trained by the CIA, and that's just in a small, very inconsequential country like Guatemala, which most people at that point in time in America weren't even aware of, probably couldn't even find on the map if they were asked. So you can only imagine what was going on in Berlin and Germany and East Berlin and West Berlin, and there's certainly ample evidence that there were all kinds of horrendous things going on in Berlin, because that was sort of the central point, the epicenter of the Cold War.
Yes. And
people were routinely disappearing in Berlin. I mean, being snatched, both their people and our people. There were a large number of people aligned with the CIA and the Army that virtually, that vanished in Berlin during the Cold War and were never seen again, and still haven't been seen to this day. I mean, they're people, they weren't high-ranking people, but if you do the research, you'll find that there's a large number of people, and a large number of people, including military intelligence officers, who were murdered by the Soviets. So when people say there was a Cold War going on, there absolutely was, and it was pretty heated between the Soviets and the U.S. and a lot of people died. And I interviewed Gottlieb before he died for the book, and actually he was fairly helpful. There were some things that he wouldn't discuss, but there was a lot that he would, and he was very eloquent and vocal about the effect the Cold War had on him and what was going on in East Berlin and West Berlin and Germany at that time, and that he had lost a number of friends who basically vanished or disappeared, a couple friends who were murdered. So and he offered that in the way, what was interesting, he offered that in the way of a defense for what he did in terms of the MKUltra programs. And he said his defense was, look, as far as I was concerned, we were at war, and when you're at war, you do things you normally wouldn't do during peacetime. It's the same line we're getting today with the war on terror. It's the same exact line, same exact rationale, and
absolutely.
for me, it's it's no more effective then than it was today. I mean,
I agree.
it's not. It's you pick your battles, and this country has picked a lot of battles that I think are unwise, and I think Guatemala is a good example. I mean, we basically killed a large number of people in Guatemala just to protect the interest of United Fruit.
Indeed, it's so. Yes.
That's absurd, and now we've got the same thing going on with oil companies in Afghanistan and in Iraq and Libya, and things just don't change. They just they maybe become a little more expansive, a little more sophisticated, and the intelligence agencies learn to a large extent from their past mistakes. It's harder to get information and
less heavy-handed nowadays. I think back in those days,
it's very heavy-handed, especially with predators. With the fact that they can fly something over your house and basically pick you off. It's
right.
There's not much defense against that.
No, indeed, and you're absolutely correct. Here, let me just cite this here in the assassination manual here under number 2, accidents. The most efficient accident in simple assassination is a fall of 75 feet or more onto a hard surface. Elevator shafts, stairwells, unscreened windows, and bridges will serve. This manual is written in a very matter-of-fact way, like someone is teaching a college course or something to this their teacher's class. So, there's an example right there. Right there.
And that's precisely what. I mean, it's coincidence. Again, it wasn't planned, but that's precisely what happened to Olson. He basically fell. I think it was a little more than 100 feet onto a very hard surface, a New York City sidewalk, and was, internally, amazingly enough, he wasn't, externally he wasn't that damaged, but he died fairly quickly, and I had the pleasure and honor of interviewing the hotel manager who actually found him, who's now dead, and who I became pretty good friends with. He didn't coincidentally he didn't live far from me. He was one of the first people I searched out for the book, and at that time I was living here in Florida, and as it turned out, he lived about an hour and a half, 2 hours away from me. So I was able to go over and see him on a regular basis, and we got to be friends, and that helped a lot, because the more I talked to him, the more he remembered, and as it turned out, one of the last conversations I had with him, it became very clear that one of the people that had a hand in murdering Olson, Pierre Lafitte, had actually worked at the Statler Hotel at the same time as a bellman.
That's very interesting.
And when Armin Pastore revealed that, I was able to. I went immediately to George White's diaries and date books for that, and there it was that there was a couple notations about Lafitte working both at the Statler Hotel and the Roosevelt Hotel in New York City, and that was a common ploy at that time on the part of the CIA, was to plant people as employees in hotels, because you're constantly having foreign dignitaries and foreign agents and foreign foreign government employees checking into these hotels, and who's better than to track these people and keep an eye on them than people that ostensibly are bellmen or porters or whatever, employees of the hotel, and that was
totally inconspicuous.
Yeah, totally. You could knock on the door and go in and check the radiator or the curtains, or it's a perfect ploy. And as it turned out, in subsequent to the book being published, I've come across over the last 5 or 6 years, subsequent to the book being finished, to come across like numerous instances of other incidents not murders, but involving people at a number of New York City hotels where it was obvious that there were agency people employed. The CIA, Olson was taken to the Statler Hotel because the CIA basically favored that as a hotel. That's not much of a hotel today. It's gone back to being called the Pennsylvania Hotel. But in 1953, it was considered a very Tony hotel to check into, and they had a number of bars and lots of jazz entertainment, and people loved going there, and it was very common to put up foreign dignitaries both at that hotel and some of the other hotels. So and the CIA in 1953 had a pretty extensive New York City office, as they do today. I mean, most people don't realize the CIA has offices in almost every major urban center. Houston, New York, you name it. And some of them are small, some of them are large, but there's a presence in all of those cities, and people, anyone that's aware of the CIA's charter knows and should question
right.
Why, they're not supposed to do anything domestically yet.
No domestic activity, yes.
Right, but now with of course the war on terror, there's it's a perfect excuse to pretty much do anything they want to do.
Right. Well, we only have a couple minutes left here, Hank.
Sure.
I wanted to give you an opportunity to tell us what you're working on now. I noticed in your biography that you listed that you were working on something on George White, actually.
I actually, for the same publisher, I'm doing a biography of George White, and the publisher was interested in that, and I was interested in doing that mainly because I had amassed a lot of research on White, and 90% of it really couldn't go into the Olson book because it didn't pertain to the Olson story, but yet White was a really fascinating character. I mean, there's nobody, there's nobody like him today, and there probably never will be anybody like him. But that book's not going to come out for at least another year. I interrupted that book to work on a book concerning the Kennedy assassination, and it deals exclusively, doesn't try to solve the Kennedy assassination at all, but it deals exclusively with just some of the synchronicities and high strangeness, and that's in the subtitle that surrounds the Kennedy assassination. And I chose to do that because when I was researching the Olson story over the period of 10 years, there wasn't a week that went by where I didn't bump into the Kennedy assassination or somebody involved in the Olson case that was also involved in the Kennedy case. And there were just a number of really startling coincidences and facts that emerged, and such as the fact that the one of the fellows that killed Olson, Pierre Lafitte, actually in 1963 ended up in New Orleans working for Clay Shaw as the chef at the International Trade Mart, because that was his cover job. He was he'd been trained in France, and it was it was the Trade Mart that actually verified that for me. They had one document still left concerning the Jean Martin that had worked for them, and that was Lafitte's cover name for the CIA. And
that's astonishing.
There he is in New Orleans, at the same time as the Kennedy assassination, and probably, rubbing elbows not only with Shaw, but, who knows who else.
Right.
And there are reports that he also worked for the Riley Coffee Company before going over to the Trade Mart to be a chef. And of course Oswald worked there. And then, lo and behold, I dug a little more into it, and I did put this in the book, in the Olson book. He was arrested in 1963 by the FBI in New Orleans he was wanted for fraud. He had defrauded somebody, because this guy was really notorious. He wasn't a violent person, but he was a master at disguise, and defrauding people. He's one of these people that could meet somebody and within a half hour talk them out of $50,000. Yet at the same time, so he was arrested by the FBI in 1963, but that charge, he was let go within 2 weeks because it was revealed that he had been an undercover agent for the FBI at the same time that he was working for the CIA.
Jeez.
So that whole charge just vanished.
Is that book available now?
No. That book will be done in about another month, and then we'll go for editing, and hopefully we'll be out, within 3 or 4 months, and some of that's covered in that book. But most of that information is actually in the Olson book. If you just go to the index and look to the pages that concern Pierre Lafitte, all of that.
Very good.
All of that New Orleans information is in there, and I was just blown away by that. I was shocked because that was 10 years after Olson's death, and yet here's Lafitte still bouncing around, and he was also in the Belgium Congo at the same time that Patrice Lumumba was murdered. So I suspect that Lafitte might have also been QJ Wynn, the unidentified assassin who is pretty notorious with the CIA. Because the only reason I know that he was there is he made the mistake. He sent a postcard to from the Belgium Congo that was dated the same week that Lumumba was murdered, and he sent the postcard to a guy called James Phelan, who was a pretty well-known journalist and very prominent with Saturday Evening Post and sided against the Jim Garrison investigation. And as it turned out, we now know that Phelan was working surreptitiously, for the CIA and the FBI as an informer. And I was able to interview his wife and daughter because he was dead at the time that I was writing the book, and they confirmed the fact that Lafitte was a fairly regular visitor in their home. They considered him very mysterious, and when Phelan met with him, it was always one-on-one. They never had a conversation in front of Phelan's wife or daughter, but both of them very much remembered Lafitte, and they had fond memories of him because he was such a character.
Interesting. Well, Hank, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you very, very much. We can do it again if you want.
Oh, absolutely.
I appreciate it. Yeah.
Man, I could talk about this all day. And you
I know.
Many topics.
Maybe when the JFK book comes out, we can talk and connect some of this stuff up. Yeah.
Man, that would be great. That would be great because that sounds like a great idea. Thanks again, Hank. And
thank you very much. I appreciate it.
We'll catch you very soon. Okay.
Yep. Take care.
You have a nice night. Bye.
You too.